My guest is here, and I'm going to bring him in to have this conversation. We are joined with the man himself, Warwick Powell. How you doing, Warwick? I know it's late, man. I'm sorry. I know it's not your fault. I mean, I know it's not my fault, but still, I always feel bad that it's so late there. You doing all right?
It's all good. Daylight saving has kicked in Australia, but where I am, we don't change our time. So,
Even better.
It's a little bit better for me.
Yeah, because Jeff, it was like 10 o'clock at night for Jeff. And I felt so bad for Jeff. I felt so bad. But Warwick Powell, he is adjunct professor at Queensland University. In fact, I'll just go through this. Adjunct professor, Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Networks group of companies. He's also president, Data Integrity and Supply Chains Association Incorporated. Warwick, you wrote several fantastic articles. And initially, I was going to bring you on to talk about the power article, meaning this inability for the U.S. to compensate for the power demands that they actually want in the society itself. But you wrote another one in the meantime that I think it's more appropriate in this moment. This was the article that you wrote. I was kind of introducing it to the audience. America Against Itself, Redux. And I'm putting this in the context of this. This is Trump. I don't know if you've seen this video. You probably have because you pay attention to this stuff all the time. But I'm going to play it once more for the audience.
Mr. President, what? The Insurrection Act, under what conditions or terms would you do?
Well, I'd do it if it was necessary. So far, it hasn't been necessary, but we have an Insurrection Act for a reason. If I had to enact it, I'd do that. If people were being killed and courts were holding us up, or governors or mayors were holding us up, sure, I'd do that. I mean, I want to make sure that people aren't killed. We have to make sure that our cities are safe. And
Mr. President.
what?
Now, what's more interesting about this is why would a reporter need to ask Trump, will he implement the Insurrection Act? Nobody asks Joe Biden that. Nobody asks Obama that. Nobody asks Bill Clinton that. Nobody asks anybody else or any other president that I'm aware of. But they're asking Trump. Now, Trump has military in American cities. He's weaponizing ICE as like his own Gestapo force all throughout the United States, who is picking up Americans, not just immigrants, also just brutalizing the rights of Americans in and of itself. And recently, in a deranged, out of his mind speech where something literally seems wrong with Trump, like he seems mentally incoherent, where he's talking about putting the military, saying, hey, some of you are going to be in the cities around the United States. And then you write the article, America Against Itself. Break this down for us. Make us understand what is happening here. I think there's a part in your article where you said kleptocracy to proto-fascism. I even named the thing that. Give us a breakdown of this. What's going on?
Look, in some ways, it was my own efforts to try to understand what's happening in America. Obviously, I'm in Australia, so I'm a long way away. But what happens in America is of abiding interest to people around the world, in part because America remains an important country, both economically, militarily, and culturally. So the dynamics of the United States matters to people all over the world. So it was an attempt by me, in a sense, to get my own head around where I think things are going, or where I think things are. And in some respects, it all came together because of a few things. One was a conversation that I had with some colleagues in Texas about 3 years ago, both from the blue side and from the red side. And in separate conversations, they both said to me that the United States had become an increasingly violent society, and that they attributed much of America's plight and existential risks largely to domestic factors, and in particular, the other side, to a point where people were starting to rationalize in their own minds that it was entirely justified, in the name of national existential preservation, the killing of the other side domestically. So those remarks really left a bit of an impression on me in terms of where the United States had sent, well, according to sort of people on the ground and observing what was happening, had gotten to. Obviously, we've seen in recent days the mobilization of the National Guard. We saw an unprecedented gathering of senior military figures to be lectured in effect by the president and the Secretary of War about domestic, the threat being the domestic invasion, the use of American cities as testing and training ground for the military, etc., etc., and of course the federalization of the National Guard being deployed into various cities. So that was a second lot of things. Also got some friends in the United States, in Portland and other places, who, of course, are feeling the current dynamics intensely. And I guess I reflected upon some of the conversations that I had with them, and found it very difficult, in a sense, to come to grips with. But I guess ultimately the essay that you talk about tries to put things into a little bit of a context, to try to come to grips with what's going on. And the context, I guess, belies my vintage, because it reminded me of a couple of things from the early 1990s that helped me make sense of what's happening. One was a book by a guy called Wang Huning. Wang is now a member of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, and obviously is in the central role in the government there. But in 1990, he took a trip across America, a 6-month trip, and wrote a book called America Against America, where he outlined his observations about the paradoxes of America, a country that had accumulated incredible financial wealth and, in fact, quite a lot of material wealth. And yet, from his point of view, it had all the hallmarks of a society that was already at each other's throats: the atomization of society, the rampant individualism, the loneliness, and the loss of a sense of community, the things that actually hold people together. The other thing from the early 1990s that came to mind was a movie that I saw called The Trigger Effect. And it didn't go that, it wasn't a big box office success, perhaps because the content was a little bit dark and somber. But it was a movie about a town, a mainstream American town, where the electricity went out. And it followed a series of intertwined plots of different characters and what happened to them in the course of the days after the loss of power. Initially, everyone thought it was just a short-term blackout and everything would be okay. But as hours dragged into days, society very, very quickly fell apart, and people turned on each other, and the violence of American society came out. So I guess for me, it was that article was a way of bringing some of those threads together and trying to make some sense of where the United States seems to be presently at.
You also point out metrics of balance, like, let's say, indirect metrics that indicate something is going on with the society. You talk about the gun, the numbers of violence from the standpoint of the number of multi-person homicides. You talk about the glass, or let's say the bulletproof glass. You talk about, meaning you list several indicators of the society is getting more violent, and you can measure it, not just economically, but in real numbers of the number of people who are being killed in the society itself.
Yeah, there's something quite unhealthy, clearly, about a society that keeps, track record of mass shootings. So mass shootings are defined as shootings involving 4 people, as well as the perpetrator, where people are injured or killed. And there's a website which keeps track of this. Now, we've had pretty much a mass shooting on a daily basis for years. That's to me is, reflects the sort of comments that Wang Huning made, where there's this social anomie, people are disconnected, they feel isolated, there's a lot of anger, etc., etc. I also mentioned some statistics about the opioid crisis in America. Now, everyone, of course, has focused on this question of fentanyl, which is all about China, and more recently, the drug cartels, ostensibly from Venezuela. But that's right. But with blowing up ships with no evidence,
Yeah.
but it seems that a 50-year war on drugs, because it's been going now for 5 decades, has simply not worked if the real objective was to reduce the sort of social and individual fallout from opioid addiction. And that means tackling questions of why it is that there are so many Americans who are addicted to opioids. So having a look at the social circumstances that gives rise to these sorts of problems, not just trying to roll out some sort of machoistic response to the supply chain. And you mentioned also the bulletproof glass demand, and that's the one to me that really is the silent signifier, because bulletproof glass is something that only wealthy people and those who own facilities are in a position to afford. And demand for bulletproof glass in the United States has been growing at about 9.5%, 10% compound annual growth rate, and is expected to continue growing at those rates for the remainder of this decade. And what does that tell you? It tells you that there are a large group of people with the means to make these sorts of self-protection decisions who are anticipating increased risks to person and property. None of these are signs of a well-balanced, functional society, and that's a worry, obviously, because a functional, well-balanced society not only is doing things that its own citizens, I think, would favour, but this loss of balance and loss of a sense of place in the world, what I've called in other places, this chronic sense of displacement anxiety that now runs through the American political elite and body politic, that's reverberating in not only violence inside America's borders, but in all sorts of violence external to America's borders as well. And these are symptoms of an American social settlement and political economy, some might call it the empire, corroding from the inside.
Explain, let's define a few terms: displacement anxiety and anime. I think this is the term. I've heard Chris Hedges use that term also. Like this, it's almost like a spiritual component of a society. I have to be honest with you. People, we had this woman who was running what is her name? She was a Democrat. They used to call her a witch. She wasn't a witch. She tried to merge these things of spiritual politics, not in a religious sense, but in a sense of there's something sick in the way that we're operating that needs to be resolved. And that's not something we typically deal with in a political sense in this country. Like this idea of, if there's something wrong with you, then you need to go and deal with that. We deal with the political issues. And her thing is, like, these things aren't indistinct from what Marianne Williamson, these things aren't indistinct from one another. These things are fused at the hip. How can you have a society that's flourishing and functional if it's sick internally in the way that it's effectively operating and in the way that the people are dealing with that stuff? You pointed out fentanyl was a symptom of that, not a cause. Meaning people are doing fentanyl because something is wrong in regards to the way those people are feeling and the separation, this anxiety that they're feeling against the larger society itself. They feel displaced. They feel out of sorts or disconnected, maybe a better term for it. Explain anime to me and explain displacement anxiety and how those things come together to create this level of violence, chaos, etc.
Look, displacement anxiety is an idea that I guess I've tended to use to describe the nation at large. And I guess more to the point, refracted through the attitudes of the political elite in Washington in particular, where for the best part of 35 years, there's been a view that America won the Cold War and was therefore in a position to dictate terms globally. And the United States became a unipolar hegemon that was able to call the shots no matter where you were in the world, the United States could call the shots. It did so by being central economically, central financially, certainly central to the world culturally, particularly through the power of Hollywood. And also, I think, central, well, obviously central to the world through sheer military or hard power capabilities. The last 10 years or so has, I think, seen the realization that that position of centrality is no longer the case, that the United States is no longer central to everything. It's not to say that the United States isn't a big country and isn't influential and important, but that it's no longer at the pinnacle by itself. And a realization that that's the case, even when that realization is being resisted, because it is being resisted every day, that realization has given rise to a strong sense of displacement. And with that comes an anxiety that America is no longer in a position that it once thought it was, that it really believed that it was entitled to be, that it was either a God-given entitlement or one that was earned through whatever struggles America has gone through, or what have you. And because the United States has been what I guess I'd call decentered, there is a strong sense of emotional, cultural, and political anxiety that comes with it. So that's at this sort of macro level. But I think you're right in drawing a link between those macro anxieties and the sort of social anomie that that observers often talk about. And this goes back to, you know, a sociologist, French sociologist, Emile Durkheim, who talked about this idea of social anomie. He pioneered the study of phenomenon like suicide, for example, as expressions of societies where people would fall through the cracks, where they were either discarded or felt left out, disconnected, unwanted, and no longer valued within a social network. And ultimately, many would take their lives as a result of that, or turn to other forms of escape, if you will, because they felt lost. So that's, you know, the turn to opioids and those sorts of things. So this idea of a national displacement, I think, is connected to social anomie in a few ways. One is the reality that American living standards for the bottom 50% of people actually haven't improved for the past 40 to 50 years. Real wages haven't gone up at all for that group of people. There is a large group of people who feel that the transformations in the last 40 or so years have left them behind. That, and you often see this then manifest politically in ideas like, you know, quite, you know, in my view anyway, quite dangerous and potentially violent ideas, such as "I now feel like a stranger in my own country" views. Right, so you see a lot of that sort of displacement as well. That certain sections of society for whom the American dream has turned into a nightmare now feel like that they are no longer part of an America that they believed in. And the politics of that is to try to reclaim that, to reassert their rightful position, to make claims on the resources that they once believed that they had, to blame those who they believe took it away, etc., etc. And so you've got a society that is fraying at the edges, but it's also fraying deep in the core. Now, the other dimension of all of this, which I think is quite an interesting one, is that, and this is a paradoxical one or a contradictory one in the American cultural context, I think, from a distance anyway, and that is a combination of a long period of progressive nihilism, where this sense of civility and spirituality in a society has been stripped out, has been hollowed out, largely because people have sort of lost their sense of wonder at the world and have become fixated on the commodity, if you will, you know, on the stories of Wall Street and the sanctification of the trading board and the flicking red lights and the candlesticks, of the reds and the greens, and all of those things have replaced this sort of deep sense of purpose and belonging. But at the same time, we've seen into that gap re-emerge a very animated sense of religiosity, but it's incredibly politicized, if you will. So it's no longer a personal endeavor, which for a long time, I guess, religion had become, much more of an individual, personal endeavor. It has again rediscovered a sense of social vitality, and it's linked to apocalyptic sort of politics, and this has all become quite intertwined, animating people in ways that is leading to an incredible amount of violence. Actually, we're seeing the anger spill over, and I think we've seen that already over the last 10 years, and all these episodes of sending in the military, of public demonstrations, of the storming of the Capitol in January 6th a few years ago. They're all expressions of these deep senses of displacement and social anomie. So these are symptoms of the hollowing out of the material foundations of the American dream, right? This is why, in material terms, and in spiritual terms, because they've come together now, there's a hollowness to everyday life, and that's no longer satisfactory for a lot of people, and easily exploited by political forces at the same time.
Oh, that is a great explanation. I guess I always look at it as a kind of ontological shock. It's like, well, we've lost our primacy. And what are we if we don't have our primacy? Do you think this had anything to do with the fall of the Soviet Union? And I know this sounds like a curveball, and I'm going to go back to the article, but having an enemy and being able to define yourself through your enemy, in a sense, kind of gives yourself purpose. And when the Soviet Union falls, the U.S. is the sole superpower. Okay, well, what are we in this globe as we stand alone as a primary force?
Look, it is easy to create a sense of shared purpose when you've got an external enemy. And I think we're starting to see that again. So as we get domestic enemy, we're also seeing a politics of, a dual politics, one of looking for the threats from within, whilst at the same time seeking to define the threats from without. Yeah. And all of that is mobilized to undergird what has essentially been an assumption of executive power over the other powers that existed in the American division of labor, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. And it's become quite clear that in the last 6 months or so, that the executive has pushed the boundaries and has in effect laid down the gauntlet to the other arms of the American political system and challenged them to demonstrate whether or not, in fact, they're up to it. And so far, by and large, we can see that Congress has been particularly weak, I think, from an observer's point of view. Certainly, when you listen to commentators speak of the Democratic Party, they're nothing but scathing in terms of the abject lack of direction, fortitude, and leadership. So that's a certain view that I guess I've observed about the hollowness of the Congress in the face of the challenges that are being posed to it by the executive. And I guess time will tell as to how effective the judiciary is. Obviously, we've seen federal courts make some rulings concerning the mobilization of the National Guard into Portland, but that's being challenged. There are some challenges, legal challenges now to the tariffs that have been imposed, again, through executive order. The mobilization of the idea of national security is unprecedented in the way that this idea of national security is being conceived. Right? I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, but I suspect that the constitutional founders would have had a sense of what national security meant, which really was, I would suspect, quite a narrow view of the state coming under threat. Right. And it had to be narrowly defined because in the way that the American body politic was set up with the three arms, the aim was to have these checks and balances, which in many ways made it difficult for any single arm to do too much by itself. And but the idea that a national emergency would justify the suspension of the rule of law and those sorts of things was always narrowly understood. And but of course, President Trump is bringing a very broad understanding of what constitutes a national security imperative, justifying the actions that he's taking under, various statutes. How these legal cases will play out over the next little while, I think, will be very interesting to watch, and perhaps even create its own existential crisis, right? Because no doubt there will be strong views about this in the United States, and depending on how the courts come down on these issues. I mean, I saw today that Elon Musk is tweeting about how if you let the judges willy-nilly, make these rulings, and we've got judicial, what was the word he used? I can't remember offhand. Let me have a quick look. It was quite an interesting observation from Musk, because what it really was saying, that's right, if any judge anywhere can block every presidential order everywhere, we do not have democracy, we have tyranny of the judiciary. And
such nonsense. I'm sorry.
And so this is a real test, in a sense, of America's own sense of itself. What is it to be a constitutional republic, right? And whether or not what's happening, which I guess my own assessment or my own way of coming to grips with it is that these are sort of symptoms of deeper problems. Can an America come through this and address its fundamental material and spiritual and social cultural challenges in a way that perhaps brings it back closer to what most people, I think, would think of America as to what America ought to be? Look, I don't know, but these are the things that I think for people who live in America, it's obviously incredibly tangible and consequential in a very in-your-face kind of way. And for us outside of America, I guess it's important because an America that has not resolved its own internal contradictions is actually a very destabilizing and potentially dangerous force within the world. And so we're all mindful of that.
Oh, we are well past that. Elon Musk needs to be deported. What a dumb statement. The reality of it is, if you and I are playing a game and you're cheating and I call you on your cheating, and after 5 times of calling you on your cheating, you're like, well, this is unfair. How do you always get, your way? It's like, dude, you cheated. Every go, you've cheated. Like you're moving a pawn, like 6 spaces or something like that. Meaning habitual liars lie. And Donald Trump is effectively lying and being called on his lies as a justification to put military, National Guard, or whatever in these various locations. The judge is saying, this is outrageous. What are you doing? You have no real justification for this. That's like if somebody said, hey, what is your legal authority to murder Venezuelans in a boat? And Elon Musk comes out and says, well, wait a minute, this is tyranny of the judiciary because they're pointing out that he has no legal authority to do it. He has no legal authority to do it. We're a country of laws. And so, yeah, Elon Musk needs to shut the hell up. God, man, I can't stand him.
Look, I think it's quite clear, and when you read the comments of people like the president's deputy chief of staff, Stephen
Miller, yeah, he's
Miller,
basically
and you read the comments or the speech that the president gave at the gathering of the army and generals and navy admirals, and you read the sort of comments from the minister or the secretary of war, Pete Hegseth, it's quite clear that they have a very, I guess I called in my article, a proto-fascist outlook, right?
Yes.
It's not, and I say that because I think that it is still an embryonic, emergent phenomenon but one which is quite clearly gathering pace. And you know, I mean, I think I made the comment. I do wonder whether America is going to have its own Reichstag fire episode, which was the episode in 1933 that Hitler used to justify his usurpation of power. And you know, because he had to, you know, bring order to chaos, and you can see the sort of rhetorical mobilization around chaos, order, safety,
Charlie Kirk.
etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of this stuff is being mobilized at the moment in the name of these objectives to create a sense of national emergency, which would therefore justify a suspension of the rule of law. In other words, to declare a state of exception. So at the moment, the president is in effect declaring states of exception on a block by block basis and a tariff by tariff basis. Each occasion, he is making a declaration concerning a national emergency that warrants these actions. So it is a salami slicing, if you will, of what it means to be confronted with a national crisis or a national emergency or a security risk to the nation's own survival. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of this over the next 6 months. And because he's testing the boundaries every time, the test is being laid out, which is, does anybody dare to pull me up on this? Does anybody dare to stand up against me? You know, whether it's in his own party, and clearly there's very few, if any, who dare at the moment to call this out. And as I mentioned earlier, observers of the Democrats are sort of scratching their heads, wondering how it is that they can be so so hopeless.
Yeah, they are. I think part of that is the economic system, where Democrats have a deep contradiction with, let's say, their supposed political role in the country versus the economic constraints that are placed on them because of a capitalistic system. Effectively, you're supposed to be the left-leaning party in the country, and yet you're restrained from actually being a real left-leaning party. So what do you have? You just have Trump. And for the last, 8 years, Trump has been the only thing they talked about. And they lost, meaning they put everything in, all of their chips, into this idea of Trump. And Trump still won. They're busted, meaning they've been broken politically, and they have not been able to cobble themselves back together.
And there's no constituency, is there? There's no political constituency anymore. I mean, many years ago, I was in the United States on an exchange program observing elections. In a previous life, I was heavily involved in election campaigning, polling, analyzing voter behavior, demographics, and those sorts of things. And it seemed that one of the big drivers, which I think is leading to the malaise that the body politic is in now, is that getting out the vote became increasingly difficult as people became more apathetic. And the research showed clearly that the best way to get out the vote was to mobilize people through negatives. So negative campaigning really started to kick in. The only problem with negative campaigning is that each time you run a negative campaign, the voters, their hide gets thicker, their skin gets thicker, and so the next time round has to be more intense and more over the top. And eventually you build a political system that can only be operationalized through fear and hatred. And that's where we've gotten to now. And it's very hard to bring it back from there until it comes to a screeching halt and falls apart and forces people to reevaluate how it is that they've arrived at this point. And so that was 29 years ago when I was speaking with pollsters from both sides of the political fence in the United States, as well as researchers in the space, observing what they believe was the peak of negative campaigning. But of course, with the benefit of 29 years of hindsight, it was quite clearly only the beginning. And and it's a very dysfunctional and unhealthy way in which societies ultimately seek to find solutions to their problems.
Yeah, it also destroys any kind of faith or belief in the political system. It makes people cynical and nihilistic, just by definition. You mentioned something in your article where you're talking about the proto-fascists, and just now when you're making the comment about the Reichstag fire, I think what is it called, the Enabling Act, where Hitler was able to effectively take power, or if you want, an insurrection act of sorts, of being able to just kind of take power based on something that took place. Charlie Kirk, as you point out in your article, was this weaponization of a political assassination. And almost without missing a beat, it went into Charlie Kirk died. Oh my God, let's all of us be at the funeral ceremony for Charlie Kirk. We're going to have Trump, Hegseth, Rubio. We're going to have all of these people there. We're going to have Tucker Carlson. Meaning they turned that into a political cudgel immediately. It was almost like right off the bat. It became, hey, this is advantageous to us, the fact that he was murdered. Let's now use this to our benefit. And as you point out, they could be anything. I mean, the Antifa thing is a really good example also. Antifa doesn't exist as a political entity. And yet you find all of these cultists who are online screaming Antifa, Antifa, terrorists, etc. Meaning they're creating a context, true or false, by which Donald Trump can effectively act. I'll give you another example. On January 6th, there was a bunch of militia guys that were hanging out in Virginia with guns and everything else, loaded, like literally fully armed, ready for bear, waiting on Donald Trump to give the word to effectively attempt to overthrow the government by force. Trump never apparently said it, in which case those guys hung out in Virginia because it was legal for them to have the guns and weapons and everything else in Virginia. I'm saying I think you're hitting on something real. I think you're hitting pay dirt with this, that there is an aspect of the society that is fragile and that is, let's say, on the balancing act, and it's not balancing all that well. Give me a take on that. I mean, the Charlie Kirk thing is a really good example of this, though.
Well, I mean, the research that I've seen, and there was a research paper published by the Cato Institute, which can hardly be described as the bastion of left-wing views of the world. You know, Cato is on the libertarian end of the political spectrum. But they published a research which actually showed that the sort of left-wing radical political violence paled into insignificance compared to so-called right-wing political, violence. Right. But the fact that facts don't matter anymore tells us something about the sort of fragile emotional state of the society at large, and this goes back to those comments that my blue and red colleagues and friends made to me, which is that America has become an incredibly violent place where each side sees the other as the existential risk par excellence. Yes. And if that is the case, then the emotional reaction, and politics is largely a question of emotional commitment, the emotional reaction that can be mobilized and then fed and amplified around singular events such as assassinations and even if they weren't assassinations, the deaths of important figures, can really fulfill the function of being these focal moments where people galvanize around a focal moment and channel their collective energies into these events to create a sense of belonging, right? That they are part of something. So this is filling gaps again. As other parts of the social fabric have disintegrated, the desire to find a place of belonging, I think, is an important part of how these sorts of quasi-evangelical political movements recruit and then channel the energies of its members towards whatever purposes they send them, to do. And when people are swept up in these moods, they will do things that they could never contemplate doing by themselves. They almost become liberated from the constraints of either good manners, polite culture, or their own sense of what they can do by themselves. And when you're swept up as part of a crowd in a mood, then people will do anything. And we see that when crowds go crazy, and even the leaders who egg these crowds on can easily lose control of them. And that, of course, is the flip side risk, is that these sorts of crowds get fermented, and then they link up across the country, and eventually they take matters into their own hands. Now, we've seen that happen before as well in the United States, when crowds of people who identified domestic enemies in particular took matters into their own hands, and that, of course, resulted in lynchings and other public demonstration events, right? Which aim to, send clear messages to people about the acceptability or otherwise of certain kinds of, social behaviours and setups. And perhaps the United States is at that precipice once again. It's certainly, I think, increasingly dangerous. From a non-American point of view, we often now look at wondering whether America is a place that we can visit at the moment, because of the problems of the border security, because of the well-known searches of social media and all those sorts of things now. And so there is that sense of, what I guess I'd call a political violence that has enveloped aspects of ordinary day-to-day behavior. So the politicization of these, simple things, coming through customs, the act of having a phone interrogated and social media posts questioned as a basis of rejection from entry, things like that, I think are incredibly unnerving for people around the world.
Yeah. I want to ask something else. It's funny. My ex several months ago was like, yeah, I don't think it's safe to come to America. It's like, dude, you're Austrian. You shouldn't have a problem. But it didn't matter, right? It's on some level of perception, on some level of reality. I want to hit something else that I'm actually rather fascinated by. Gold for the first time hit 4,000. Now, the question around gold hitting 4,000 is about trust. Does this mean, so what was her name? I think it's Arnaud. I think it's a he. Bertrand, I believe. He made the point of saying, when we see gold go up this high, this shows a lack of trust in the current, let's say, economic political order. And it often symbolizes a changeover in political orders, that people are effectively trying to hold their money in a place where they don't want that money to be lost, because they don't necessarily trust the political entities that are, let's say, the prevailing state of things. Is that true? Is that your take on this? That part of the reason that gold is accelerating to this high has to do with a level of political chaos that's not just in the US, but also in Europe. And people are trying to find other places to put their money as opposed to, let's say, US treasuries, or for that matter, let's say various companies or stocks, or those type of things, meaning they expect something to happen, and gold is their refuge.
Yeah, look, it's always worth bearing in mind that where there are buyers, there are sellers. So there are obviously people selling gold as well, and taking the US dollars, right? So the US dollars is somewhere in the system. But there are people taking their profit by selling gold for dollars. I think some of this is driven by growing institutional accumulation of gold, and we're seeing that particularly with central banks around the world increasing their holdings of gold as part of their reserves. And that is in part a risk mitigation strategy, so that they are recalibrating their portfolio to introduce more diversity into it, reducing their exposure to certain asset classes which they deem may be of a higher risk than they might have even a year ago. In particular, treasury bonds, which were, of course, until probably about a year ago, still viewed by and large as the global risk-free asset. it's certainly not viewed that way these days, which means that if you've accumulated dollars and you want to cycle those dollars into other kinds of assets, the question is what do you do, right? So as for instance, the People's Bank of China slowly eases down its holdings of US Treasury bonds, it still has US dollars. Right? So bear in mind that if it's not refinancing maturing bonds, it's taking the dollars back. So it's getting the dollars. It's running trade surpluses, so it's accumulating dollars. And the question is, well, you know, what does it do? So what it has been doing quite clearly has been buying gold, buying other commodities. Where it can, it's been financing, using those dollars to finance projects around the world, particularly in renewable energy or clean energy projects, but not only those, other infrastructure projects. So the People's Bank of China is looking for ways in which it can diversify its holdings of liquidity into assets that that are useful and which will retain some kind of sense of value over time, especially whilst we are going through a period of such incredible financial system turbulence. The United States is really creating incredible amounts of uncertainty and risk in global capital markets, and consequently holders of finance capital are considering ways in which they can diversify their value holdings.
But I don't remember who's I was reading this from. I mean, I read so much over the course of a day just to do the show. But they were making this point about finance capital, industrial capital. Maybe it was you. I think it might have been your other article on this idea of energy production, that this belief that we can do multiple things at once, meaning we can bring back industries to the United States and the energy requirements for those industries. And we can have these kind of like AI and technical projects that also require huge amounts of energy. And that the energy grid of the United States is not sufficient to be able to accommodate both, and not just not accommodate both, the amount of energy they would need to produce. It's illusionary, meaning you can't do both of these things simultaneously. Go into that for me, because the article was fantastic.
Look, one of the really interesting things about the American economy over the course of the last 20 years is that whilst the GDP has grown, and remember GDP is a measure of financialized transactions, the amount of energy produced and consumed in the American economy has largely remained reasonably flat, right? So as an energetic system, it hasn't been generate any substantial growth, right? Well, and it's because a large part of its gross domestic product, its financialized expansion, has been through increased system liquidity, increased prices of services, which actually use very, very little energy, and consequently, we've had economic growth without energy systems growth, right? Now, we've got this situation where the Energy Secretary about a week ago said that the United States needed to create an extra 100 gigawatts of firm capacity in the next 5 years. Now that is, let's say, about 10, 12% or so of the total system, right, in 5 years. There's very little hope of that actually happening. Now, the reason why this is needed, incidentally, is because of the rapid demand of electricity coming from the explosion of artificial intelligence data centers, on the one hand, as well as an aspiration to reindustrialize. Now, reindustrialization really means automation, and automation is electricity intensive. The fact of the matter is that China's success in automation, being now the standout global leader in robotics implementation, manufacturing, as well as deployment in industrial systems, is only possible because it has an energy system that can cope with that, That's generating all this new demand for electricity. So America needs electricity for both AI data centers and reindustrialization. Over the last 5 years, the cost of electricity, wholesale prices in America has gone up 267%. And that's in large part because AI data centers is making greater claims on a limited capacity within the system. Hence, the Secretary of Energy says we've got to build more. The real question is can America build more? It certainly, in my view, can't build 100 gigawatts in 5 years. And that's because they're not financial constraints, really. If push comes to shove, the state could fund this. The problem is fundamentally material. So there aren't enough skilled workers to do the work that's needed. And it's not just building new generating systems, it's upgrading transmission networks. So you've got to be able to move electricity from point A to point B. If you don't have the right skills of people to work on those high-powered transmission lines, these projects don't happen. Now, typically, a high-powered transmission project in the United States can take anywhere from 12 years to 19 years from conception through regulatory approvals, design, build, to finally become operational. We're talking, somewhere between 10 and 20 years in effect for major transmission infrastructure, substations, poles and wires to actually come out of the ground. That's a problem. We, of course, know that there has been significant regulatory impediments, but that's not the only impediment. Even if you got rid of all the regulatory slowdowns that affect the speed at which these major projects go, the United States simply doesn't have enough of the materials needed, whether it's the physical equipment that you need for generating, for these new generating units, or of course the materials that you need to build the transmission systems. So the chances of the United States being able to do this is very, very low. Now, what does that mean? Well, as it pushes to do this, and of course it can achieve something, right? So it's not that it can't build stuff, but as it strives to do this, the impacts is what economists would call a Dutch disease, which is that a boom in one sector actually sucks resources out of all the other sectors. And as it sucks resources out of the other sectors by boosting costs, it makes all the other sectors less competitive. And so as electricity costs are ramped up, other sectors in the economy will confront higher energy costs or higher electricity costs, and households, of course, are going to be hit with higher electricity costs. So the dilemma, the horns of the dilemma that the United States finds itself in now is that it has dual ambitions around reindustrialization and AI, both of which require massive expansion of the electricity generating system and distribution network, which cannot be accomplished certainly without having much deeper cooperative relationships with China, where a bunch of this equipment comes from in the first place. Now, China, of course, is manufacturing all of this equipment, and it's got an energy system which has, somewhere between 40 and 60% buffer within its system, at any moment in time. So China's demand can grow into a system that's there ready to accommodate it without any impact on pricing. So now China is selling clean energy technologies around the world. And that's going to enable other parts of the world to become more competitive in terms of their manufacturing, which also has implications for American manufacturing's competitiveness as well. So these are just fundamental, real material dilemmas. These aren't questions of political will and ambition and desire. It's simply that there's not enough of the stuff that's needed to make any of these dreams come true.
Wow. Warwick, I'm going to put both of those articles below. Again, you are fantastic. Thank you for this. Great breakdown. I swear, really good breakdown. Warwick Powell, he is adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology, chairman of Smart Trade Network Group of Companies, and also president of Data Integrity Supply Chain Association Incorporated. Warwick, you have a fantastic rest of your night. Thank you for this, man. Always appreciate these breakdowns.
Great to be with you, Jamal.
Be safe.